Welcome to the sort of satellite office of the Center for New American Security, where we're doing this event today. I'm Richard Fontaine. I'm the president of CNAS, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here for this event that is commemorating the 35th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. Even at a time when there's a renewed focus on Russia and its neighbors and sustained attention on the Middle East, there remains in policymaking circles in Washington today, I believe, an underlying realization that America's destiny is intrinsically bound up in the future of Asia. I can see that they're piping in background music to help me sort of, get going here. So if I start moving, then you'll know why. Asia has always been obviously very important to the United States, but never more so than today. The region's economic dynamism, its role as a locus of geopolitical competition in the face of a rising China, combined to demand a greater share of American attention and resources. This is, of course, the driving rationale behind the administration's pivot or rebalance to Asia. And the question of rebalancing to Asia should be one not of if, but of how. At CNAS, we've worked hard to build an Asia program that is commensurate with the region's importance. Under the leadership of Patrick Cronin, the Asia-Pacific Security Program develops the kinds of strong, pragmatic, and principled policies that characterize the Center's work more broadly. Examining the important ties between the United States and Taiwan constitutes a key element of this work. Today's event presents us with an opportunity to reflect a bit on the framework for those ties, the Taiwan Relations Act. It was 35 years ago this month, in April 1979, that the United States enacted the TRA, which provides a legal basis for America's relations with Taiwan. The bill noted that the Congress found the TRA's enactment necessary to, quote, help maintain peace, security, and stability in the Western Pacific, and to promote the foreign policy of the United States by authorizing the continuation of commercial, cultural, and other relations between the people of the United States and the people on Taiwan. The TRA outlined provisions for supporting the Taiwanese people, the sale of defense equipment to Taiwan, established the American Institute in Taiwan, and stated America's strong resistance to threats, boycotts, or embargoes aimed at Taiwan. The TRA passed both houses of Congress by overwhelming margins, and the final vote in the Senate was 85-4. Having spent more than a few years of my own life working in the Senate, it's amazing to look back and see that any piece of legislation of consequence could garner such a large majority of votes in the Congress. And I think that the Taiwan Relations Act is a marker of just the degree of support that was in the legislative body at the time for this framework for closer ties with Taiwan, but also for the Congress's role in foreign policy during the Carter administration and then thereafter. Since the TRA's passage, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship has weathered shifts in the security environment in the Western Pacific, but it remains a cornerstone of America's engagement and policy in Asia. As China continues to rise in light of changes in the strategic environment, and as the United States continues its to balance its engagement in Asia with other global priorities, now is an opportune time to step back for a bit and examine what all of this means for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. To address this and other topics, we're honored to have with us this morning Vice Minister Andrew Shah. Minister Shah serves as Taiwan's Deputy Minister of National Defense and comes to that position after a long and very distinguished career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Minister Shah is a graduate of Fujian Catholic University, National Cheng Chi University, New College at Oxford, and Queen Mary College, and University College in London. He began his career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1982, working in the Department of North American Affairs. Among his numerous postings, he served as Taiwan's Deputy Representative in Ottawa, Canada, Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Center in New York, Representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Center in New Delhi and in Jakarta, and as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's recently taken up his new responsibilities at the Ministry of Defense and serves as the Deputy Minister. We're honored to have the Vice Minister here with us today to present keynote remarks on his view of the Taiwan Relations Act and its legacy, after which we'll have a panel discussion with several experts on Taiwan and Asia-Pacific security issues generally. So please join me in welcoming Minister Shah.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure to be here speaking to this group of very knowledgeable and very capable, able audience. I left Washington in 1996. I didn't realize my first opportunity to come back is to face this audience talking about Taiwan Relations Act and the security relationship between Taiwan and the United States. It will be an even bigger challenge for me when I say yes to accept the job of the Deputy Defense Minister. First let me go back a bit about my career and the Taiwan Relations Act. In 1998, December, I was a student in England when the news was announced that the United States is shifting its recognition to the PRC. We were heartbroken. I remember together with me at that time was Jason Hu, who later became the foreign minister. We don't know why at that time. I think some of us decided that instead of going to the private sector, instead of leaving Taiwan, we are going to the public service. So I later on in 1982 went back to Taipei and joined the Foreign Service in the Department of North American Affairs. However, the first piece of important challenge for me was to deal with the August 17 communique limiting the sales of arms to Taiwan. In 1994, I was assigned to our office here in Washington, and again I face pleasantly facing a challenge of the Taiwan policy review, making a lot of improvements and changes for our relationship. Then the 95 Cornell visit by President Lee is another big milestone. Then the 96 missile crisis. After the missile crisis, I left for Taipei and for Canada, then later to Taipei, and joined the International Organization Department and become APEC senior official, working on UN and working on WHO issues. 2001, I went to New York. In New York, of course, I arranged the visit by President Chen, and then 2008, I was appointed Deputy Foreign Minister. In all these positions I held and all the work I have done, I see the dramatic changes between Taipei and Washington. Let me give you a few examples. Firstly, the office name. When I first joined, it was CCNA. Quite a few people didn't realize what CCNA stands for, Coordination Council for North American Affairs. And I know people in town often joke about the Chevy Chase Non-Alcoholic Association. But in 1994, the office name was changed into Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office here in Washington. So that's a big, at least the name Taipei as the capital city of the Republic of China now has some sort of representational, flavor in it, and people can literally find where to apply the visas by checking in the yellow pages. Secondly, I think the office visit by our officials here in Washington as well as in Taipei changed. I remember the days that we have to meet in Plaza Hotel across the State Department all the time. But nowadays, I guess people can go to offices of the American government, except probably the White House and the State Department. But the AIT officials in Taipei, they in the past again had to meet in the office of CCNA Taipei. Nowadays, can also go to all the government agencies in Taiwan. I think that's makes things much easier. Now about the the transit visit I arranged in 2001 for President Chen, and later on, of course, when President Ma also transited here quite a few times. I remember before President Chen's visit, the guiding principles for the United States government to arrange such a transit visit was, safety, convenience, and comfort. But 2001, for the first time, when I was asked to arrange that visit of President Chen in New York, he was able to have meetings with officials, with congressmen, with think tankers, and also with people in the community. In the past, they can only stay in hotel rooms and doing nothing. Because somehow, apart from the three guiding principles, they added one more principle, dignity. So that's, again, quite a big change. Last night, I had the good fortune of having dinner in Twin Oaks. Remember, Twin Oaks that was only be able to use by the representatives of Taipei for personal entertainment in the past. But now I was told that even the National Day reception was able to be held there. I mentioned August 17 communique. That was time when we were very worried that the quantity and quality of the arms sold to Taiwan will be limited. But then today we see F-16s flying our air. The Apaches joined us recently, the P-3C, E-2K, and all the frigates, all these American weapon systems. Now we are now putting our arsenal. So again, this is a very welcoming change, and the visit by senior people from both our governments, people like me, are now here speaking to you in Washington in the open forum, and the different levels of dialogue we have on our security issues being taking place almost on an annual basis. So all these are happy changes because of the Taiwan Relations Act. So I think David Keegan recently wrote in a brief saying that this is one piece of legislation is probably the most successful in guiding the relations between the United States and the foreign governments. But today I'm here to talk about the U.S.-Taiwan security relationship. So I will now discuss the issues relevant to our security relations only. Now we need to know how we in Taiwan perceive the security threats facing us. But because of the time limit, I will simply say that in terms of we are now facing, of course, threats, unconventional threats like because of the climate change, all these natural disasters we're facing. And also we have problems with Japan over the islands of Diaoyutai. But that, again, being after the dialogue and through negotiation, we now have reached some sort of agreement on fishery, so that no more collisions, intrusion of our fishing vessels or their fishing vessels still happen, but now there's a procedure that we can solve these disputes. And with the Philippines, I think we're still negotiating on the peaceful settlement of this fishing boat incident. But to us, the biggest threat still coming from the other side of the Taiwan Strait, the mainland of China. I think for obvious reasons that firstly, China, because of its economic growth in the past 20-some years, now they are increasing their defense budget also. Since 1989, I think, except a few years in between, they have increased their defense budget always by double digit. This year, for example, it will be a 12.2%, and very soon they will, according to IISS in London, that their budget will be exceeding that of the US in 2030. Now they are number 2 ranking in the world. But apart from having the money, they are also able to develop their weapon systems either indigenously or via military purchase. For example, in 2013, there are 28 war vessels being launched, including the aircraft carrier Liaoning, of course, and also some nuclear Jingji submarines and some kilo submarines. And they developed their own fighter planes, J-20, J-31, steel fighter jets, and they bought 100 Su-35s from Russia. And I think they also have shown their satellite and space capability during this search for the missing Malaysian airline planes. I think this is what they are capable of doing. But in terms of their attitude, I think because of the economic growth and the increase of their military might, they become much more confident and become much more assertive in all these issues they have with their neighbors. The announcement of the ADIZ in East China Sea, knowing the overlapping areas, it will happen with the neighbors. They just unilaterally announce it, December 23rd. And also January this year, they have announced the new fishery agreement in Hainan Island. Again, show how strong-willed they are in their claims into waters where there is disputes. Even more important, they are now developing their A2AD capability. The cyber capability also is increasing. So all this indicated basically in our region, because of the rise of China militarily, it has already caused a sort of arms race among countries in the region. Japan is again reconsidering their constitution and also about their budget. The Philippines and Vietnam, they're getting their new vessels or submarines. Countries in the region are now really worried about the incursion of the Chinese into this region. And as for Taiwan, we have to see China as a threat because of the 1,400 missiles aiming at Taiwan all the time, and that China has never denounced the use of force against Taiwan. And also there's anti-secession law, which gives them the quote-unquote legitimacy of invading Taiwan one day in the future. Now, facing all this mainland Chinese threat, President Ma has made it his national security approaches based on three major pillars. The first one, of course, is in order to build a prosperous and stable Taiwan in order to live the way of our life without being coerced by many of China. The first approach, the first pillar of his national security approach is to improve relationship with mainland China in order to de-escalate the tension or the risks. I think based on the 92 consensus and that the One China principle and individual interpretation, the two sides since 2008 started talking, and until today, I think every week there are more than 860-some flights between the two sides, and every single day there are about 5,000 visitors from China visiting Taipei. Those visitors include, until today, almost all the governors of major provinces in China, and mayors, city mayors, and many of the deputy ministers. Even a minister visited Taipei before. And from our side, of course, you see the visit by many of our leading politicians. The latest, of course, is the famous meeting between the two ministers in charge of cross relations in the mainland of China in Nanjing. And we have so far signed 19 agreements, including the ECFA, the Economic Framework Agreement. That has been going on since 2008, and we are at this moment discussing the possibility of setting up representative offices in each other. But because of the lack of mutual trust. And because Taiwan is a democracy, and there still is no consensus as how we deal with China politically. So all these meetings, all these agendas are basically economic in nature and apolitical. And even though the two ministers' meetings are very political, yet the agenda is political in itself, but the agenda again is apolitical. It's all about procedures and how we deal with each other on very pragmatic issues. So this is the first approach of President Ma's national security. The second one is a viable diplomacy. That no longer we are fighting for diplomatic recognitions with China, and we were happy to maintain the 23, now 22 diplomatic allies we have. But instead, we are seeking substantive relationship with countries all over the world in order to pursue our national interests. I must say, apart from maintaining the diplomatic recognitions, we have indeed made tremendous improvement with the rest of the world. I mean, for example, we now have 131 countries or territories granting Taiwan with a visa waiver or landing visa status, and we have signed FTA with New Zealand and Singapore, plus some of our allies, and we are interested in joining even more international trading organizations, and we are able also to send representatives to the WHA, World Health Assembly meetings, and ICAO for the first time after we left the UN as a special guest of the president. But all this, particularly the improvement of cross-strait relationship, all these statistics, but don't let those scenarios or statistical people here or anywhere, because the relationship basically for us is still hostile. When the Minister of Defense, Minister Yan, was asked in the Legislative Yuan about his view on this current status of relationship between Taiwan and mainland China, he said it's hostile, simple and imperial. And because of what I have mentioned, the missiles aiming at us, because of the not yet denounced the use of force, because they made the unification of Taiwan as a core interest of Xi Jinping's China dream. So what should we do? I mean, apart from we have said, the third approach, I think, is probably the most important, is that we are not able to enter into this arms race with China. So what can we do with this big neighbor of ours? I think it was either Confucius or Mencius said that when you are big dealing with small, you need to be kind. When you are small dealing with the big neighbor, you need to be wise. We certainly cannot rely on our survival on the kindness of mainland China. So somehow we need to be wise in dealing with China. Now, our defense strategy moved from time to time. I remember the days when Chiang Kai-shek wanted to return to China with military means. That was from 1949 till 1969. Our basic defense posture is offensive. Then later it turned out that it's not possible. So from 1969 to 79 basically is offensive slash defensive, join it together. But since the derecognition of the United States until 2002, our defense posture become very defensive in nature. Now today, our defense strategy is that we want to build a resolute defense plus credible deterrence. So the fundamental principle of our defense posture is just can be described in a few words. It will be defensive, it will be preventive, and will be deterrent in nature. In order to have a deterrent effect, but without entering into this arms competition with mainland China, we have to be able to develop innovative and asymmetrical approaches of our defense. Now, this is asymmetrical basically means that we want to use a cheap price, simple, easy to execute weapon system that will cause damages to our enemies and with a high efficiency. So this is what we wanted to do. And we are now developing our own asymmetrical weapon systems, such as the Xiong 3 anti-missile missiles. We have this Thunder 2000 multiple launch rocket systems. We are developing our UAVs. We have this PGG, the patrol guidance ships that we own develop. And we are also developing the mine laying, sea mine laying capability. And also we have also people engaged in the cyber war, warfare studies. But to us, is one more item missing, which to us is important, is the submarine, that the underwater warfare capabilities of Taiwan, because we think this will be an important item for to create the effect of deterrence, as well as is one of the asymmetrical systems that we are now requiring. These submarines are being agreed upon by the American administration in 2001, but 13 years passed that we have not yet have sort of a clear indication of how that will happen. So at this moment, I think Taiwan is developing or trying to develop our own indigenous submarine. And I think people may have different thinkings about submarine. So basically our request is that we should be able to sit down with the United States government to discuss the system that is suitable for a preventive war in Taiwan. Now, under this way of thinking, we need to also to discuss firstly the budget and also the equipment and the resources, the human resources. I think in terms of budget, we know the expectations of the United States and other friends of ours that we should have 3% of our GDP as in the defense budget in order to show determination to defend ourselves. Actually, we have done that in quite a few years, in the year 2002 or maybe 2005. But the problem we faced at that time is we couldn't get the weapon systems we're requesting. So the budget has to return to the Treasury, and we, as the ministry, being criticized by the legislative yuan as well as by the cabinet. So these days we have set 2.52% of our defense budget, while the other agencies in the government are decreasing their defense their budget by 8%. We maintain the level as of last year, and we also are committed to our friends that if and when we get the weapon systems, we'll be able to get the budget through a special budget or through other means. So we are committed, and I think this commitment is shared by politicians in both government and opposition party. And basically, people we talk to are agreeable that the defense budget should be provided to the National Defense Ministry. Now, equipment-wise, as I have said, we are engaging in either indigenous development, or we need the support of the United States of America. When I was in Europe, people after the Crimea crisis, many of your European friends are asking us whether we can still rely on the Americans for that support. And my answer to them is, who else can we turn to? I don't think the Europeans is a strong supplier of weapon systems in the past or proved or in the future. Now, on the human resources, since we are entering into this era of asymmetrical weapon systems, that we need actually a smaller but a smarter and stronger fighting force. As of the system we are now having, male citizens of the country serve 1 year in the military. it turned out that we are constantly training people without having a fighting force of our own. So we are now trying to transform our military into an all-voluntary military system in 2016. After that, every male citizen only simply need to serve 4 months in training and join the reserve, so that there's a linkage between the population and the military. The transformation has been going on for quite a few years, and I must tell you that we are quite encouraging by the application into the professional soldiers because of the improvement we have made, because of the information we have passed it on to the general public about serving in modern day the Republic of China military. Now, the challenge we are facing, of course, is that there are people thought that because of the change of relationship that we don't need defense at all. I mean, but and also there are people in this country and others and elsewhere believe that all we are asking is for quote unquote big ticket systems, aircraft, submarines. But I must tell you that we are very pragmatic people. I think we want value for our money. So the systems we're requiring or acquiring are not exclusive of each other. We will be needing some big systems which will be deterrent in nature, but we also will need other systems which will be very useful to Taiwan in defending ourselves. Now, why should the U.S. support Taiwan? Firstly, we talk about Taiwan Relations Act. Of course, under the Taiwan Relations Act, it's the policy of the U.S. to provide Taiwan with arms of defense nature. And Article Section 3 also say the United States should make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such a quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient defense capability. This is your legal obligation. But let's talk about our friendship and the values we share together. I think for the United States, Taiwan is a democracy, is a free society, a society that respects basic human rights, and it's a market economy. So I think somehow this value that we share together should make Americans treasure the system that we have established, basically modeling after the United States. And of course, we have been allies since World War II, and during the Cold War era, that Taiwan is a part of your containment of the communism. It's an important part of it. So based on our historical relationship, I think the United States should support Taiwan. This is again a moral obligation, and also in your rebalancing to Asia, I think Taiwan can also share the burden of the United States in making some sort of contribution, which I'll talk maybe later. And another important issue is the credibility of the United States in defending its allies and friends is at stake. I think people, after what happened in Crimea, now asking that question, that is the Americans still a credible allies of our friends in Asia-Pacific region. So people are basically watching. But how can the United States help Taiwan? I think it's very important that the United States should reaffirm and restate its commitment to Taiwan. That is why I'm quite happy to read that the House of Representatives passed this 494 resolution on the 26th of March, reaffirming the importance of Taiwan Relations Act and to emphasize the U.S. Commitment to a prosperous East Asia and peace in the Taiwan Strait. And your senior director in the National Security Council, even Medeiros, also made a statement on the 28th, basically saying this year is the 35th anniversary of Taiwan Relations Act, which is the United States law, and to which we remain firmly committed along with the 6 assurances. So I think somehow if such a statement can be made from time to time, that will reassure not just Taiwan, but the Taiwanese people, but also countries in the region, including friends and foes that will be listening to this, and it will have even bigger effect than some of the weapon systems that we're requesting. Secondly, of course, we hope the United States will be able to supply Taiwan with defensive weapons that we requested. And we may have different viewpoints on which system is the best to defend ourselves, but if we can just sit down and have educated, discussion about the system, then we may come out with a solution which is suitable for both the United States and Taiwan. Now, and again, another area that we wish the United States will be giving us more support is the international organizations, functional international organizations, such as what you did in the past about the World Health Organization, later the ICAO, the civil aviation. Now I think we need those organizations because they are functional organizations, because without which the lives of people, the well-being of people will be endangered, such as the International Maritime Organization. I think is probably also a very important one. And we certainly are interested in joining TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we also think that the U.S., if can include Taiwan in your security system in Asia Pacific. Not just Taiwan wanted to have the support of the U.S. I think Taiwan can also make a contribution to the United States and as well as to the region. For example, in all this HADR, human assistance and disaster relief works, we have proved that we are able and willing partners of the United States as well as the world. We sent our C-130s as far away as to Haiti after the earthquake. We are the biggest donor after the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. I think we are one of the first countries to respond to the Philippine typhoon Haiyan and to Palau. We are also part of this international search for the Malaysian missing airplane. So in that we have proved that we are able and willing partners. And I think also the second one is in your rebalancing to Asia. Rebalancing does not limit it only to military areas. It also you also include diplomacy, economic, social, education, capacity building areas. I think because of our deep-rooted relationship with countries in the region, that we are one of the leading investors in Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and we are nowadays also expanding our area of cooperation into education, social, NGO networking, labor relationship. So in that sense, we are building up the capacity of those countries, that we are helping those countries to become more democratic, free, entering into a market economy. So in that sense, I believe that we'll be able to work and contribute to that of the United States. And lastly, I think it's also important to note that in the few contentious areas, especially the island disputes in the region, we are now proposing some very specific proposals in the East China Sea, where we see as probably one of the most contentious area, because there's no international regime to managing the possible crisis, and because of the Chinese announcement of the IDIZ. They are nowadays, every single day that you see the fighter planes from various countries entering into this tiny weeny little airspace, and the fishing vessels, the frigate, the coast guards. So a possible collision, a possible misjudgment may happen into a skirmish, which is not welcome by all. So President Ma basically proposed that we should set aside the disputes on sovereignty and started to work together through peaceful means, dialogue, international law, and jointly develop the resources in the region. And that has received a positive response from Japan. That's why we have now have the this fishery agreements with Japan already, that both parties benefit from this agreement. And we certainly hope this spirit of dialogue, restraint, international law, peaceful means, joint exploration of resources can be spilled into the South China Sea, where until this day seems to have difficulties in having a solution or to reach the code of conduct in the region by ASEAN and other countries. Now, I think I probably have overstayed my time, but I just want to say 35 years ago, when the U.S. shipped this recognition, many people were in panic, were desperate, were very sad, and we thought that was the time when the United States was saying goodbye to Taiwan or the world. But after 35 years, we survived. Not only we survived well. We become one of the most vibrant democracy in the world, and we are prosperous in our economy. We are freer, more democratic, and we are much more confident these days in dealing with our neighbors, including many of China. And we are also able to participate in world affairs, in various functional international organizations. And we are also able to make contributions to the region, to the world in HADR or in peace initiatives. So, the world didn't say goodbye to Taiwan. Actually, the world now is embracing Taiwan. So we welcome that, and we think that we owe all this to the enactment of the Taiwan Relations Act. For that, we want to celebrate with you and to say thank you very much. Thank you. I'll finish my remarks here.
Vice Minister Shah, thank you very much for those candid, comprehensive, and I would say wise remarks. Zach Hosford, I'm not sure whether it's possible to remove the sort of stand up here, but it might be useful so that some people in the audience can see the stage. We're going to turn now to a panel discussion for the next hour and 15 minutes or so about U.S.-Taiwan relations. And let me just say that, as Vice Minister Shah ended his remarks, talking about 35 years ago with the Taiwan Relations Act and the concern inside Taiwan, I think very few people would have seen just how prosperous, how strong a democracy we have in Taiwan today, and indeed how strong and capable a deterrent force Taiwan still is able to field with strong U.S. support that you mentioned by Senior Director of the National Security Council, Evan Medeiros, with his recent statement about the commitment of the U.S. to the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances. So these are all very healthy signs, and yet questions remain, just as they did then. And those questions might be grouped into 3 areas that I think our speakers will principally try to start addressing. One question is the question of what the Chinese expect of relations with Taiwan, including U.S. relations with Taiwan and their own cross-strait relationship. And we couldn't have anybody better than Alan Romberg to help think us through that. He's been watching this for a long time, first as a career Foreign Service officer, including stationed in Taiwan, an expert on the region and on China, currently distinguished fellow and director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, thinking about the context in which the Taiwan Relations Act was created, and putting that in terms of the present context politically. And next, question about China's capabilities, especially their growing military capabilities, assertiveness, the expression of their expectations, if you will, in the People's Liberation Army, in their armed forces. Abe Denmark is an expert on the PLA and on China and on U.S. policy toward Asia-Pacific. A former defense official colleague at CNAS is currently the Vice President for Political and Security Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. He's testifying tomorrow, so whereas tomorrow he'll be given 5 minutes to speak, we're going to give him 8 to 10 minutes, along with the other panelists here today. So it's a much more generous allotment of time before we turn to the audience. And last but not least, this question of the credibility, the resolve of the United States commitment and rebalancing policy, the strength of U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Joanna Yu Taylor, again, who's also been a public servant, is worked with Project 2049, a very prestigious research project on China and Asia, is currently director of the China in the Pacific program at the Center for the National Interests. We'll hear from Joanna. So without further ado, sitting here at the table, I'd like to begin with Alan Romberg for 8 to 10 minutes of initial insights. We'll go to Abe Denmark and then Joanna. Minister Shah, you maybe will kindly agree to join the questions and answers when we get questions from the audience, and we'll be available to continue this debate. So over to Alan Romberg.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you to CNAS for putting this event on. It's a very timely event, obviously, and great opportunity after many long years to see Vice Minister Shah again. It's been very long. I'm going to try to, as Patrick said, talk a little bit about context. First, going back a little bit in history to talk about what people expected at the time of normalization of relations between the U.S. and the PRC and the TRA. I'd like to talk a little bit, maybe in some scattershot fashion, about the international context in the region today, in which the U.S.-Taiwan relationship functions and in U.S. policy overall functions, and then maybe just a little bit coming back to Taiwan. Obviously, it goes without saying that the most important international strategic development of the past 35 years in the region and perhaps the world is the rise and the modernization of the PRC. You don't need me to lay out the importance of economics or security implications, but the point is that when President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger opened to China in the early 1970s, and then normalization took place at the end of the 1970s, it reflected what even then was a growing realization of the coming importance of the mainland to the region and to the world. Now, it's true that Nixon and Kissinger may have had a somewhat narrower focus for their immediate needs, vis-a-vis the USSR, the Vietnam War, and so forth. And indeed, at that time, the PRC was fractured, weak, challenged by a strategic threat along its border. But the potential of a country of China's size and centrality, and the fact that the PRC was not going away, was something that American experts had talked about for some time. And despite the political complexity, including the long-standing relationship with the Republic of China, there was no question about the need for the U.S. to break out of the stalemate we were in. It was clear then, and it certainly is clear now, that many challenges would be posed by the rise of China. What was perhaps less clear then, but is absolutely clear today, is that while the U.S. and China cannot resolve many of the pending problems by themselves, without their cooperation, many of those problems simply cannot be resolved. So, like others, including Taiwan, the U.S. will continue to try to work through those problems with Beijing, as it also tries to work together on common challenges. What was also clear then, and is clear now, is that the United States was not simply going to turn its back on the people of Taiwan. Now, I think we have to acknowledge there was an assumption among some fairly important people at the time that Taiwan and the mainland would simply find a way to move toward peaceful reunification in a short period of time. To the extent that that assumption existed, it was obviously wrong. What people missed, I think, to some extent, maybe to a great extent, was the ability of the people and the leaders in Taiwan to absorb the body blow of normalization and to move society in a direction that has produced the impressive economic, political, and social development that makes Taiwan such an important partner today, not just for the United States, but for many of its many neighbors, including the mainland. Today, Taiwan is a vibrant society, looking at current developments, some might say overly vibrant. And probably most of us have had the opportunity to visit Taiwan and experience and admire that vibrancy. So while the nature of cross-strait relations obviously presents challenges and concerns, what we also see today is a Taiwan that is able to manage those relations in a way that gives voice to the views of the people in Taiwan rather than simply following the diktat of Beijing. And I think the relationship with the United States has had something to do with that. We also know, however, that the neighborhood in which Taiwan lives today is not only dynamic, but also fraught with dangers of various sorts. And those circumstances clearly affect the environment in which cross-strait relations proceed and in which U.S. policy operates. So I'd like just to touch on some of those briefly to lay the ground for some further discussion this morning. In Northeast Asia, from my perspective, the most disturbing development is the, I have to say, nasty climate that exists between China and Japan. We can all point to this or that action or statement and point a finger of blame at one party or the other. And indeed, I think both are in some degree responsible. But however blameworthy some of the Japanese leadership positions, sometimes meaning statements or actions, and sometimes meaning non-statements or not taking actions, the notion now popular in the mainland that Japan is remilitarizing or even has already remilitarized is absolute nonsense. And the campaign that Beijing has mounted around the world regarding this and its efforts to exclude Japan from various activities is, in my view, simply not worthy of a great nation like China. While the U.S. has obviously been discomfited by some of Mr. Abe's statements and actions and has made that pretty clear, it's not going to join in this campaign and indeed has and will take various steps to oppose it. Japan's relations with South Korea have also been more than a little troubled, but perhaps we're now seeing the first signs that leaders in both countries will seize the opportunity, an opportunity, by the way, which I think the Obama administration deserves some credit for creating, to move step by step toward a more constructive and one hopes even cordial relationship. Needless to say, North Korea represents a challenge to peace and stability in the region. But one has to say that so far none of us has found the key to meeting that challenge beyond making crystal clear to Pyongyang the drastic consequences that would lie in store for it should it provoke war. Now, we may have slowed some developments, but we certainly have not killed off its nuclear weapons program or its missile program. And so that in that endeavor, we have not succeeded. There are some tentative signs. There may be some changes afoot. But I guess I have to say that I fear that, at least for the short term, those changes may not be in a positive direction, although I hope over the longer term they may be. And here's an example where the PRC could be coming to play a more robust role to try to head off provocative North Korean behavior. I have to say, though, I see no sign so far that Beijing has altered its strategic view about the value of the DPRK to China's national security and the threat that Beijing believes would be posed to its national security by a unified Korea under Seoul's leadership allied to the United States. I would note in passing that Beijing's creation of an ADIZ, an Air Defense Identification Zone, in the East China Sea, while disturbing and in my judgment handled poorly, I don't think has really changed the strategic picture substantially. If anything, it's put China's neighbors on edge and on higher alert, which somehow doesn't strike me as what Beijing was really aiming at. In Southeast Asia, too, we see disturbing signs of assertive PRC behavior, and I'm not going to go into further detail, but I do think it's noteworthy that states beyond the Philippines and Vietnam have now begun to voice open concern about the mainland's long-term ambitions and the meaning, for example, of the so-called 9-dash line. Let me conclude these opening thoughts by observing that I think the Ma administration has handled these challenges quite well. Although sharing Beijing's perspective on the issue of Diaoyu Senkaku's sovereignty, as the minister pointed out, instead of contributing to exacerbating the problem under the heading of the East China Sea Peace Initiative, it has forged a fisheries agreement with Japan, which has been of great benefit to Taiwan's fishermen. And while not ceding its position on sovereignty, it's taken a responsible position about not allowing private interests to provoke incidents. Nor, of course, has it joined hands with Beijing in its highly confrontational stance against Tokyo. Indeed, Taipei has strengthened relations with Tokyo. In Southeast Asia as well, Taiwan has not changed its claims, but it has not sought to create controversy. Considering the future, I see no reason to anticipate any basic change in U.S.-Taiwan relations, including the role played by the TRA. I know some Americans think it's time for a change, some to strengthen our ties, some to weaken them. In my judgment, while we do have our challenges, in fundamental terms, in the old words of the old saying, it ain't broke, and we have no need to try to fix it. Thanks, Patrick.
Alan, thank you very much. You made excellent points in a very brief period of time. I hope we'll have time to come back to your analysis of what Xi Jinping expects to accomplish in his tenure on Taiwan policy. As well, we might want to come back to the East China Sea question. You did mention, as Vice Minister Shah also mentioned, the cooperation between Taiwan and Japan on a fishery agreement. And President Ma has also called for a code of conduct in the East China Sea. And one question for you would be whether you think Taiwan could play a helpful role by extending the fishery agreement model, starting a dialogue in which there's a more inclusive discussion on rules of the road, if you will, in the East China Sea to try to avoid tensions from escalating. I want to turn now to Abe Denmark, heavily focusing perhaps on this PLA that's growing and their capabilities and what Taiwan actually does about that. We've heard from Vice Minister Shah a clear call for greater undersea warfare capabilities, if not submarines. We think that's a splendid idea, Vice Minister Shah, but what is the prospect of that in terms of being able to support Taiwan deterrent capability moving forward?
Thank you, Patrick. It's a real pleasure to be here. To be here in front of you. It's a pleasure to be back at an event with CNAS. Feels a lot like coming home to see my old friends. I also have always enjoyed sitting next to the Honorable Patrick Cronin on the name tent. I always like the juxtaposition, suggesting that mine is less than honorable somehow. That was nice. It's an honor to be here with the Deputy Minister. Thank you very much for coming and being with us. I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of several current and former U.S. government officials, many of whom are tremendous experts on Asia, on China, and on Taiwan, especially the presence of David Sedney, my old boss from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, when he was Deputy Assistant Secretary when I was on the China desk, and when Joanna was on the Taiwan desk. I'm sure for him that seeing us two up here must feel like the lunatics are truly running the asylum. So I'm glad to see everybody here. And I'm glad that CNAS is having an event on the Taiwan Relations Act. It's a tremendously important, I think it's one of the most consequential acts of Congress during the Cold War. And it's very important to think about its continued relevance. Just taking a look, if you could, at the list of senators who approved of the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979. My current institution, National Bureau of Asian Research, was founded in the memory of Senator Henry M. Jackson, Scoop Jackson, from the state of Washington, who was one of the senators who voted in favor of the Taiwan Relations Act, as did our current Vice President, Joe Biden. It's interesting, I imagine it's difficult to find an act of the Senate that President Carter signed and Barry Goldwater approved of. But the Taiwan Relations Act was one of them. Finally, I think that looking at their respective histories in the Senate, Jesse Helms and Ted Kennedy voted opposite each other on almost everything. But this is one of the few things that they both agreed on in approving the Taiwan Relations Act. And that level of bipartisan support has continued to this day. So focusing, as Patrick asked me to, on the military dynamic between China and Taiwan. As the Deputy Minister mentioned, the PLA's modernization has continued apace. It's China's rapid, significant investments in its defense capabilities continues to grow at double-digit levels on an annual basis. This is driving significant and rapid modernization across all strategic domains, including what the Pentagon estimates to be over 1,100 ballistic missiles across from Taiwan. But this also includes capabilities in air, on the sea surface, under the sea, in space, and in cyberspace. I think it's important to point out that this military focus remains targeted at Taiwan and Taiwan contingencies. And this idea of focus is very important. The Deputy Minister mentioned that some analysts are predicting that in 2025, 2030, 2035, whenever it may be, China's and the US defense budget will cross at some point. And this is an important trend to watch. I think it's up, a lot of that is up to the decisions in terms of budgets being made both in Beijing and in Washington. But this idea of focus, I think, draws some important nuances that looking at pure numbers can ignore. That while the United States has a global focus, global responsibilities, global interests, global capabilities, China's military capabilities, for the most part, are very focused on Taiwan and Taiwan contingencies. So there is no need to wait for China until their number is above that of the United States, or that their capabilities are above those of the United States, because they have a focused plan, they have focused capabilities. Their decision-making when it comes to military dynamics is going to be on that local calculation and not necessarily measures of global power. So thinking about the implications of the cross-strait dynamic, if we want, we can get into the technical aspects of China's military modernization, be it its investment in aircraft carriers, the modernization of its missiles and air fleets. But broadly speaking, we all understand the rapid pace of their modernization and their focus on Taiwan and Taiwan-related contingencies. I think it's important to think a lot about the implications of this for the cross-strait dynamic. It's important to note that this rapid military modernization, and especially the continued buildup across the Taiwan Strait, has continued apace while Taiwan and the mainland have gone through this important rapprochement and détente. That China, for its part, apparently still believes in the need for a robust military capability, even as the political relationship across the Taiwan Strait has improved so much. To me, the implication of this is that détente, political détente, as beneficial, as tremendously beneficial as it has been, is in itself insufficient to deter China from military attack or coercion. There was talk, the minister talked about Taiwan's defense budget and talked about how the current administration in Taiwan had set a 3% of GDP budget as its target, but it has fallen short since then. I think I appreciated that the deputy minister pointed out that both the current government and the opposition government, the opposition party, had embraced 3% as their target for a defense budget. Yet that number continues to elude us. I think it's a very interesting and problematic issue for us. To me, I would frame the 3% less as a target for us and more as a floor. That if you look at the tremendous military challenges that Taiwan is facing, 3% is the floor, is the minimum that Taiwan needs to maintain an effective deterrent. And thinking about that as a minimum, and less as the goal for us to eventually, hopefully reach at some point, I think is a helpful formulation. There are very positive indications, I think, that Taiwan's military is embracing asymmetric, innovative strategies that have been talked about for quite a long time. Its most recent Quadrennial Defense Review document, I think, is a very important document and details how Taiwan intends to embrace this asymmetric, innovative strategy. Yet a lot more work needs to be done on translating language into investment, into doctrine, and especially into planning. And I think this is where my first recommendation would be, where I hope that the U.S.-Taiwan security relationship can head, is working with one another on building out what this asymmetric and innovative strategy could look like. And this goes beyond talking about the acquisition of certain capabilities, which I think is an important part. Submarines, which the Deputy Minister mentioned, which Patrick mentioned, I think is an important part of any military capability, and especially Taiwan's. Whether or not that comes from the U.S., is developed indigenously, there's some cooperative element in there in between. I think developing some sort of subsurface capability is very important to sustain Taiwan's deterrent. But our conversations about maintaining Taiwan's deterrent needs to go beyond this issue of what are we going to sell, what is Taiwan going to get, what are the capabilities, what is the cost, when is the delivery, and get into a much more holistic understanding of planning, of doctrine, and developing a planning mechanism that's flexible enough to account for China's rapidly changing and evolving military capabilities. This planning, when we do think about procurement from the United States or from elsewhere, we need to make sure, as we always have, that it's operationally effective and useful for Taiwan's defense. But we also need to make sure that it's politically implementable. These sorts of targets that we set for ourselves that sit there for year after year, and we talk about them, we say we need to do them, but they keep staying on our board year after year, not being implemented, I think becomes a problem and gets stuck in our process. So a more direct planning process in which we can be open with one another about what's possible, what can be delivered, and when, I think would be very helpful in our relationship. But getting beyond the hardware of our military relationship, there's a very important soft power element that has been talked about before and I think should be emphasized. That Taiwan really is a model in the region for what a responsible stakeholder looks like. That Taiwan's contributions to HADR operations in the Philippines, in Japan, in Palau, is demonstrative of Taiwan's responsible behavior in the region, its positive contributions to the region. The East China Sea Peace Initiative, that's been mentioned several times, its management of fishing incidents with the Philippines and with Japan demonstrates Taiwan's responsible approach, its belief in international law in a way that's very responsible and helpful to us. And as Patrick said, and as Jeff Bader has argued before, there is a very real opportunity here for Taiwan to extend that responsible model into the South China Sea. Now, this involves the model for addressing and managing fisheries disputes that Patrick mentioned, but even more fundamentally, I think, there's an opportunity for Taiwan to clarify its position on the South China Sea and its claims in the South China Sea. Now, when I raise this with friends from Taiwan, this is often interpreted as the United States calling on Taiwan to renounce its claims in the South China Sea. And that's very far from what I think most Americans are talking about when we say that Taiwan needs to clarify its position, but rather to asking Taiwan to reflect the relationship of those claims to principles of international law, to the peaceful resolution of disputes, and to preserving the rights of all countries to freedom of navigation in international waters. Those sorts of principled statements, while not denying Taiwan's claims in the South China Sea, I think would go a long ways in towards addressing and helping us manage some of the disputes in the South China Sea, but would also put the mainland in a very difficult political position, as their claims in the 9-dash line is largely based on maps created by the Republic of China that the PRC has adopted as part of its rhetoric. So there's a lot more that we can do in terms of military cooperation on the hardware, on the planning side, but even more in terms of political and geopolitical coordination. I think there's a lot that can be done, especially on the security side, to demonstrate that the Taiwan Relations Act remains a vital part of American foreign and national security policy in Asia. As Alan said, some people want to strengthen it, some people want to weaken it, but overall, to me, the continued relevance of the TRA demonstrates that, as several people have said, that if you know what you're talking about, if you really understand the importance and the significance and the nuances of the Taiwan Relations Act, then the last thing you're going to want to do is tinker with it. And I think I'll stop there.
Abe, thank you very much. Some very important points, including the fact that the United States' commitment to Taiwan is not simply an arms sales list. It's really a strategic commitment, and trying to help with strategic, holistic planning is a key part of that. That defense of Taiwan begins with Taiwan, and by having a 3% floor on defense spending, for instance, signals a very strong commitment to that kind of defense. And then finally, the fact that Taiwan is a responsible stakeholder, and the lessons that can be learned in something like the South China Sea claims over the 9-dash line, basing the 9-dash line on land features is consistent with contemporary international law, and something that some Chinese scholars like to talk about, but the Chinese government resists clarifying. Taiwan has a room there to be on the lead on this issue as a cooperative partner in the region. We want to turn, last but not least, to Joanna Taylor to talk more about the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. We heard from Vice Minister Shah about the question of credibility that's raised around the world about America's role right now, perhaps, and its reliability, especially lately now after the Crimea incident. It was my friend Victor Cha who recently said commitment is greater than power, meaning that the United States has enormous power, but unless it's committed to the cause, will it use that power or not? And I think that question is being raised. So you've been watching the U.S.-Taiwan relationship for a long time. So what's your assessment of the strength of this credible relationship? Joanna.
Thanks, Pat. So today I will briefly review how the relationship in Asia has been evolving. And then I'm going to go into more detail to explore how Taiwan fits into those developments and discuss some opportunities that may exist to better incorporate Taiwan into the regional picture moving forward. As Patrick mentioned, the current policy environment, in addition to the rise of China, there is a U.S. rebalance. The U.S. has stated time and time again that it remains a policy priority despite the budget constraints. And in the latest QDR 2014, they stated that the main centerpiece of the rebalance remains the 5 alliances, U.S. relationship with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia, but also to deepen defense relationships with other key countries in the region, such as Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And these defense cooperations runs the whole gamut from the operational to the strategic in areas such as maritime security, disaster relief, missile defense, cybersecurity, and space resilience. In turn, the region is responding to these two trends: the increasing aggressive behavior of the Chinese, and also a U.S. rebalance in the region. And what they're doing is to broaden their own defense options. And I will just use Japan and Australia as 2 examples. Because, Abe mentioned that I was on the Taiwan desk. But in addition to being on the Taiwan desk, I also work in this other office that worked on the rebalance issue, and it was with the allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and Thailand and Philippines as well. So let's talk about Japan first, like what they are doing to expand their own defense options. And Japan has currently a very prickly relationship with the Chinese. On the alliance side, U.S. and Japan are revising the 1997 Guideline for Defense Cooperation, and they are continuing to move forward on the U.S. military alignment in Japan. And to complement U.S. stated goal of partnership capacity building, the Japan is actually currently reviewing its options of arms sales to other countries. And in turn to Japan, Japan has created a National Security Council to better handle crisis management and security policies. And there is also a renewed push to reinterpret Article 9 of their constitution. Australia, which has a warmer relationship with China because China is Australia's largest trading partner, but Australia is actually working very hard to be in lockstep with the U.S. in terms of security matters. Substantive and strategic steps have been taken, including setting up joint facilities in Darwin to allow rotational U.S. Marine Corps forces, and also inserting Australian warships into U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups in the Western Pacific. And Australia and U.S. are also cooperating in terms of cybersecurity and space situational awareness. And I might also add that countries in the region, amongst themselves, are also reaching out to each other. There was a wonderful, excellent report from CNAS about the nascent web of defense ties within Asia through military diplomacy, high-level visits, defense and security agreements, joint operations and exercises, and foreign military sales and assistance. So what about Taiwan? In an era where all the regional players are seeking to expand their options, and the U.S. seems to welcome and encourage such expansion through its rebalance policy, I feel like Taiwan's options are actually narrowing. Taiwan's role, according to the U.S. rebalance, is to keep the cross-strait peace, whereas the U.S. defines other countries' contributions by the direct relationship to the U.S. Taiwan's contribution is instead to improve its relationship with a third party, that being of China. In both Secretary Hagel and Deputy Secretary Carter's speeches on the rebalance, when they describe U.S. defense relationships with various countries in the region, they provide at least one detail on how the bilateral relationship is being enhanced. For Singapore, it's the stationing of 4 littoral combat ships. For Vietnam, they signed a MOU that allows for deepening mil-mil ties. For Malaysia, they want to start maritime cooperation. For New Zealand, there was a signing of the Washington Declaration. There's even a note for Myanmar, which is to target military engagement that will support ongoing democratic reforms taking place in that country. So Taiwan seems to be the exception when in these speeches and in publicly stated statements, all that was provided was a regurgitation of the One China policy. Of course, we all understand the context and the need for caution with the U.S.-Taiwan relationship due to Chinese sensitivities. However, stability across the strait should not mean a complete stagnation of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. There is still room for enhancement and development within the current environment. In fact, Taiwan has been very dynamic when it comes to engineering cross-strait peace. The two sides have signed various economic agreements, and a historic meeting took place between the Mainland Affairs Council and its counterpart, the Taiwan Affairs Office in Nanjing just recently in February. These efforts have not gone unnoticed. Taiwan has earned accolades from the Obama administration on warming ties with China. However, it's arguable whether these developments have contributed to the security of Taiwan itself. As Abe and Alan has mentioned, China's military modernization has not slowed down. It continues to amass missiles across the Taiwan Strait. And China still has the anti-secession law, which provides a legal cover to forcefully unify with Taiwan. So it seems that even China does not believe that unification could be a peaceful one. But why is that? Well, liberal international relations theory holds that economic interdependence will act as an emollient against political friction and war. One might believe that this theory applies to Taiwan and China. But events in recent weeks in Taiwan have demonstrated that the strengthening of economic ties with China are actually making the Taiwanese people wary of closer political ties with China. This reveals that there's a fundamental precondition or assumption required for liberal IR theory, such as mutual recognition of sovereignty, which is not in place between China and Taiwan. It's worth repeating that over 70% of the people in Taiwan support the status quo. However, it needs to be clarified that in Taiwan, that means national sovereignty and international participation without diplomatic recognition. They are okay with the lack of diplomatic recognition because they don't want to unnecessarily ruffle feathers with China. However, 15% of the Taiwanese population does explicitly support a push to be recognized once again by the international community. As per Act 1979, Taiwan was a fully recognized sovereign state by the international community. So together, that is 85% of the population that wants to maintain or expand Taiwan's sovereign existence. The youth of Taiwan have demonstrated in the past 2 weeks that this resolve is unlikely to change anytime soon. Therefore, the U.S. should consider how to manage the bilateral relationship between itself and Taiwan rather than subsuming Taiwan within the U.S.-China relationship, which is currently the dominant mental construct in the policy community. There's no reason to put orange cones around Taiwan and consider it a danger zone around which to tread lightly. In fact, As the U.S. reassesses its rebalance in the face of budget constraints, this presents a wonderful opportunity to integrate Taiwan into the broader regional context, rather than confining it in a narrow construct of cross-strait relations. Why? In part because Taiwan's situation, while unique, is also in many respects quite similar to other countries in Asia when it comes to China. Operationally, Taiwan is in the middle of China's anti-access area denial environment, but just like South Korea and Okinawa. The tactics and capabilities that make the most sense in achieving the U.S. goal for operational resiliency when it comes to its Japanese and Korean allies could similarly be explored and applied to Taiwan. Politically, Taiwan, like Singapore and Australia, has a very strong economic relationship with China, but also wants to maintain a stronger defense relationship with the U.S. to balance their security portfolio. The U.S. respects Singapore and Australia's situations and does its part to balance their security portfolio, again, such as LCSs to Singapore and Marine Corps rotation to Australia, because both countries have been steadfast friends. A similar attitude and approach could be applied to Taiwan. Inspired by conversations I've had with my former colleagues at Project 2049 Institute, I would like to propose a couple of possible paths to better incorporate Taiwan into the regional picture. One, given its central location and firm grasp of undersea topography in the Western Pacific, the U.S. could incorporate Taiwan into the regional maritime domain awareness architecture that is under discussion. Two, given Taiwan's domestic experience in successfully dealing with typhoons and earthquakes, the U.S. could ask Taiwan to participate in its joint multinational HADR operations during crises and to help build the HADR capacity of other nations when they are not in crisis. Three, given the extent of Taiwan's understanding of Chinese military thought, educational exchanges between the two defense establishments, that is between Taiwan and the U.S., should be increased. Four, given Taiwan is a leader in applied information communications technology, the U.S. could expand defense industrial cooperation with Taiwan's defense research institutes and private industries. And five, given Taiwan's knowledge of single points of failure in the PLA air and missile defense systems, that's what Mark Stokes told me, that should make it a desirable candidate for some sort of missile defense cooperation. In short, seeing Taiwan predominantly in cross-strait relations seems to confine options available to both the U.S. and Taiwan. However, if we could see Taiwan within a larger, broader context of the region, that would illuminate new options that both countries could benefit from and should seek to take advantage of. Thank you.
Well, Joanna, thank you very much for those comments. We have about a half an hour, 35 minutes, and I wonder if I could just start with the one initial question that I mentioned already for Alan, but really everybody here on the panel, including you, Vice Minister Shah, if you would perhaps say something about your perception of the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping and its perhaps evolving ambitions toward Taiwan over the next 9 years. That is, you can't forecast the future, but how should we help us think through what China's likely to be thinking, because it's not just unification, it's a question of where do they come down on U.S. arms sales in the future? Where do they deal with international participation for Taiwan? Is there room to cooperate beyond the 20 agreements on the cross-strait on Taiwan's role? Or is Taiwan just slowly being absorbed into the mainland? What is Xi Jinping up to and likely to be up to over the next 9 years? I know, very difficult question, but help us think through at least some aspect of that question. Maybe starting with you, Alan Rumberg.
Okay. I think that one never should forget the goal, the long-term goal is unification. That informs everything that the PRC does with Taiwan. It informs how Taiwan responds. I think that the problems we're seeing today over the services trade agreement in Taiwan are probably less about the specifics, though there are concerns about that, than they are about concern of what are the implications of this for the long term and overdependence on the mainland and so on and so forth. My sense has been and remains basically that the mainland has a reasonably realistic assessment of how fast they can move. I mean, there was starting this past fall, there was some concern perhaps that Xi Jinping wanted to speed up the unification calendar. You remember in the days of Jiang Zemin, he wanted to set a specific calendar for a while. That didn't prove very practical. And when Hu Jintao came in, he had a more relaxed, patient approach. The goal remained the same, but it was a more step-by-step approach. Everything had to be done under the rubric of one China, and Taiwan independence under any name would not be tolerated. But within that framework, a lot of things could be done to try to move the ball forward reasonably at a patient pace. When Xi Jinping met with former Vice President Vincent Xiao in October, he left a suggestion that maybe he was trying to speed up things a bit. But my reading of what's happened in the months since then is that realism has descended on whatever thoughts there may have been about doing that, and that while I think that Xi wants to continue to push on the issue of political dialogue, which obviously it is hoped will eventually lead to unification, that there's a pretty realistic sense that people in Taiwan are not in favor of unification. You look at whatever polls there are, and there aren't too many that directly ask that question, but when they do, it's like 60, 70% say no. So it's going to take quite a bit of time. And I think over this next decade or more, the objective will be to try to convince people in Taiwan, first of all, to strengthen the relationship economically, socially, culturally, and politically to the extent that political trust can be built, in the hope that then this process can move forward, but not press for unification. On international space, I've argued for some long time that Beijing would be well advised under the principle that there would be no one China, one Taiwan, no two Chinas, that you give Taiwan more international space. You follow the Vice Minister's advice on this subject on the functional issues. And President Ma Ying-jeou has been pretty clear that while he's obviously not giving up a claim to sovereignty as the Republic of China, that's not the basis on which Taiwan seeks to participate in the international community. And so I think Beijing would be well advised to be more flexible, generous, you pick your word, practical about that issue. I don't have any particular sense that that's about to happen. And I think on arms sales, which you raised, Patrick, my view is that arms sales are viewed largely as a problem for Beijing because they are a manifestation of U.S. hostile intent, as Beijing sees it, toward the PRC, not so much because it enhances Taiwan's defensive capability. I mean, I don't think that if it can in any way avoid having a military conflict across the strait, Beijing in any way would like to have that military conflict. But they do see the U.S. Using Taiwan as part of a larger policy of maybe encirclement's too strong, certainly containment is too strong, but constraining Taiwan, the PRC's rise. Therefore, I do not agree that the U.S. should be bringing Taiwan in as part of rebalancing or somehow leaving the impression that Taiwan is part of a U.S. security strategy that has anything to do with trying to constrain the PRC. I think it would endanger Taiwan's security, frankly, and it would certainly harm U.S.-PRC relations, which I think are very much in Taiwan's interest. So I think we need to be careful about how we do that. That doesn't, however, mean there isn't a lot we can do to strengthen security cooperation and all sorts of other cooperation with Taiwan. Why don't I just leave it at that for the moment?
Covered a lot. Abe?
Sure. Just to build off of what was said earlier, of what Alan said. Let's go back to the theory, China's theory behind this policy of rapprochement and engagement with Taiwan. The original theory, as I understand it, from Beijing's point of view, was that increasing economic and cultural ties across the Taiwan Strait, eventually leading to political contacts across the Taiwan Strait would gradually pull Taiwan closer into the mainland's embrace and furthering eventual unification. The question that I have that Alan pointed to is that the protests that we've seen, the polling that Joanna mentioned, to me suggests that the economic and cultural ties that have been so successful have not translated into that political benefit that Beijing was hoping for. The protests, especially to me, strongly signal that there are very significant political limits in Taiwan about how far this can really go. So to me, the question is, what would make Beijing conclude that this strategy is not working? Is that the election of another DPP government? Probably not, in my estimation. I think even if a DPP government comes in during the next presidential election, the mainland would still want to work with them to figure out a way to keep this contact going. But at some point, my question starts to focus on when does Beijing decide that this strategy is not working, and if so, what is the alternative? President Xi, I'm trying to define President Xi's intent is not a game that I try to participate in. In Washington, from time to time, you talk to people who've talked to Xi Jinping or talk to people who talk to Xi Jinping, and they say they understand his mind, they understand how he thinks about things. Usually you find out a few months later that they were wrong, and so I'm not going to attempt all that. If you look at the public statements he's made, there's a mixed signal. The statement that Alan mentioned saying that this is not an issue that he wants to leave for future generations. But then again, you get to the counterpart. The following question is, what's the alternative? And to me, that it does not mean the use of military force, but it does beg the question of, if not this, then what else? In terms of this question of integrating China into the rebalancing, Taiwan into the rebalancing. There's obvious political sensitivities, geopolitical sensitivities that Alan mentioned. To me, this eventually comes down to a rhetorical question that's not of terrible significance. That if you think about the capabilities necessary to sustain the ability to defend Taiwan in terms of access, in terms of regional basing, in terms of the ability to operate within an A2AD environment, in terms of interoperability with our partners and allies, whether or not that's under the rubric of rebalancing or just continuing and sustaining our ability to defend Taiwan, really to me is a very rhetorical question. I completely agree with Alan's assessment that the geopolitical costs of including Taiwan in the rebalance, specifically and explicitly, are fairly significant. But in terms of the operational consequences of that, I think it's actually fairly minor. The U.S. has, in terms of our commitment, I think we've been fairly clear about our commitment, and through the statements that have come from the Pentagon, from the White House, from the State Department, from the actions that we've taken in terms of engagement across all elements of national power, cultural engagements, and including the rhetorical device of including Taiwan as part of a rebalance, I think is actually fairly unnecessary.
Sure. I feel like I should make a speech on rebalancing policy, only because rebalancing policy for the United States is comprehensive, gradual, so it includes trade, for instance, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that whole agreement is about an inclusive rules-based system. Every part of American policy, whether it's economic, political, or military, is about inclusive rules-based systems. So it's not aimed at China. So there are ways to include Taiwan in rebalancing policy without necessarily going to the military dimension, looking like, and I take Alan's point very much to heart, to the extent that the U.S.-Taiwan relationship looks like a threat to China, yes, absolutely, China will react very harshly to that, and we could expect that. But to the extent it's part of a broad, universal, inclusive rules-based system, I think you'd agree, it's a much more benign view, perhaps, of what that means. But Joanna, how do you see President Xi's intent? And maybe for Vice Minister Shah, very briefly, what's the difference between Xi Jinping and his predecessors on Taiwan policy? I mean, what is the difference that you are expecting from the new administration? Yes.
Well, I think at this moment, knowing the Taiwanese society. That basically there's no trust of the Chinese intention, whoever the leader is. So it would be foolish to talk about unification. We couldn't even have to talk about issues of a political nature. So I think that's the very important point for Chinese somehow to learn. I mean, they claim that they want to win the minds and hearts of Taiwanese people, but they just don't know how. We're not just political animals. I mean, we want trade, of course, but the way these young people responded to this trading service agreement, I think indicated that there's no trust of China. So they need to do a lot more. When you talk about international space for Taiwan, we are pragmatic people. We're pragmatic enough to know, we will not be able to join the United Nations or international organizations that will take statehood as a requirement. When we participated in WHA, we will participate in a different capacity than a sovereign state, even though we hate it, but we have to. In the name that not Taiwan, not Republic of China, and the representation, the level of representation will be also limited. So I think somehow China should learn how to deal with these issues and give Taiwan it's not just a dignity, it's also a necessity. I mean, sometimes how can you have an effective, let's say, fishing regime without Taiwan? So we participate in the fishery. How can you not have Taiwan in health organization where SARS is spreading around? And at the same time, you talk about transportation, maritime or aviation, this is about safety. So I think, I'm not sure China is learning all this. While not learning this, they're losing, not even slowly, very quickly. If you read the survey in Taiwan, more and more people believe that everyone wants to maintain status quo, but even more people want to have a status quo leading to a separation. So this is a dangerous path for China. I mean, so I think somehow they need to do more.
Joanna, we did mean to skip you. The trust deficit is something we hear a lot from the Chinese toward the Americans, right? Which is there's just this huge gap in trust. We just need more dialogue to overcome trust. So it's interesting to hear it in the cross-strait sort of dimension of that. But how do you view Xi Jinping's intentions?
Well, so the think tank that I work for, Center for National Interest, we also published the foreign policy magazine, The National Interest. And I think late last year, October or November, the Counselor for Foreign Affairs, Yang Jieshi, he actually published a piece in our magazine laying out the foreign relations aspect of the Chinese dream, basically. And I think it's a misnomer. Like when they say Chinese dream, we naturally think about the American dream, and we make this natural connection. Oh, they want personal prosperity, social mobility, all these things. But it's not really like that, right? So the Chinese dream is really about China reclaiming its position in the world before it was being done by imperial powers, both Japanese and Western, in the 18th century. But in terms of foreign relations, though, China has a very hierarchical and almost exclusive view of relations. I mean, it actually lays out like different kinds of relationships China plans to have with different countries in the world. Off the bat, it mentions the European Union, the United States, and Russia as 3 countries worthy of having major power relations. And then it went on to mention the countries in the region, specifically, I think, South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore. There were like 4 or 5 specific countries they mentioned as having good enough relations with China that China wants to also engender neighborly relations. And then it talks about the developing world, inclusive of South America and Africa. And nowhere in that document was Japan mentioned at all. And we all know why, because China and Japan just doesn't seem to be able to get along on any issue. So it's worrisome that, in that construct, and given how important Japan is politically, economically around the world and with the US, it just doesn't even mention anything. So China has its own very hierarchical worldview, and it's laid out there. And going back to what Patrick meant about, the United States is trying to ensure a very inclusive international system, that it's somewhat democratic, not hierarchical. And China has a slightly different viewpoint. And it's out there for people to read and digest.
Thank you. If we have a microphone, we'll take some questions and comments at this point. I think, given the shortness of time, we'll take a group of them. If you'd like to raise your hand, just identify yourself briefly. And a common question, I see a couple of hands over here, and then right here over here. But why don't we start with those two hands, and then over on this side. We take those three questions.
Thank you, Patrick, and congratulations to the center on this event. I would not normally disagree with Abe Denmark, but I would say that the presence of two people who used to be part of the team at DOD on this panel is a matter that gives me great humility and great pride. That's the way I feel. I have two questions, one probably primarily directed at Alan Ronberg, and that is, you mentioned your closing word was regarding the Taiwan Relations Act, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But also, as the Deputy Defense Minister pointed out in his opening remarks, there's been a lot of evolution of the Taiwan Relations Act and the way it's been implemented over the last 20 years, over the last 35 years, but especially over the last 20 years. And I was wondering, as I was listening to the points that Joanna made, do you see, Alan, room for further evolution? Not necessarily fixing the Taiwan Relations Act, but further evolution. And are there any specifics along the kinds of changes that the Deputy Defense Minister made that make our relationship with Taiwan much more functional, really, than it was in the 80s and 90s? And then a second question for everyone on the panel, or anyone on the panel who wants to hazard it, because I get asked it a lot. Do you see any lessons, cautions? Do you see anything that we should be talking about for the U.S. relationship with Taiwan out of the Russian recent takeover of Crimea and what I would call the rather scattered international response to that? Thank you.
David said excellent questions. I almost feel like I should stop there, but I promised we'd take three questions and we'll come back and we will remember both of those important questions. So in the back there was another hand.
Oh yes, Dick Pulowski from Ski Tech. I'd like to ask a question simply to the panel to remind you to maybe address the issues of Taiwan's military modernization. And as the minister said, Taiwan doesn't want to seek a parity with the mainland China. It is dealing with war against provocation. And that means its military has got to be first-rate, top of the line, and it can be small. But it cannot be bled to death by the aircraft dying over time and the equipment going away. We've got to get serious about a realistic approach to the modernization of Taiwan's military, because in a provocation, they cannot afford to lose or be humiliated. And if it happens, then the long-term effects or consequences, and it means the whole U.S. reset in the basin, Pacific Basin, gets worse. And if to say that Taiwan is not important to the Americanization policies in Asia is wrong. A strong Taiwan is a strong representative of America's policy. And if someday, 100 years, 50 years down the future, Taiwan returns to the mainland on their own terms, then we'll have a strong friend in a province of China. It's not a lose-lose deal. We've got to get serious and place that modernization in scale with what the military has to have for its survival, and that Taiwan can always remain an object of respect for the mainland and one that they fear in the sense of provocations, because they're constantly being tested.
Strong comment. Was there a question on the end of that as well? Or is that just...
The question is your comments on it.
And over here.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank this opportunity, thank all the panelists and Dr. Cronin, especially thank Vice Minister Chow. And my question would like to ask for your advice. And then the second part would ask our U.S. representative advice. The first advice I ask from you is, would you clarify the 9 or the 11-dash line from your perception? I understand that yesterday, Chancellor Merkel met with President Xi and had presented him a map of the ancient European map in 1735. In that map, it defined the territory of China in 17 1735. And in that map, it does not include Taiwan. And it doesn't include all the first island chain, not Paracel, not Spratly. So that is the first part of the question. I also wanted to share with you the 35 years of the Taiwan Relations Act. And we'd like to come back to the fact that with Vietnam, if we're counting since 1974, when China invaded Vietnam's Paracels Island, it's been 40 years. And I think the agreements between Dr. Kissinger and Mr. Zhou Enlai has affected Vietnam much more deeply than Taiwan. So in a way, Vietnam and Taiwan share. We are on the same boat. We somehow turn into a communist country. You still have a democratic country. So we very much admire your values. We admire your prosperity. We very much hope that Vietnam would follow the development that Taiwan has been able to lead. So that we very much hope that you would join the ASEAN groups, the islanders of the Asian Pacific, and highlight the rules of law of democratic nations. So would you please clarify the 11 dash line, how you can join ASEAN in defining the international rule of law and the C, the UNCLOS, and also for Dr. Cronin and Dr. Robert and Mr. Denmark. This is a scenario. What if something happened like Crimea? What if China took over either Taiwan or Vietnam, either or? What would, if China took over Vietnam, what would Taiwan do? And if China took over Taiwan, I would suggest that Vietnam join the world to sanction China. I would hope that Taiwan would join in and sanction China as well. It's a very difficult question, but I'd like to ask it from all panelists.
We've got to limit the number of questions we're asking here. We're going to stop right there and start with Alan Romberg. Going back to the first two questions in particular about the potential for evolution in the Taiwan Relations Act, lessons generally from the handling of the Crimea in terms of perhaps U.S. credibility or lessons drawn by other countries in terms of opportunity, if you will. The importance of the modernization of the Taiwan military in terms of what the U.S. should be, could be doing on that. Well, we've heard some suggestions, of course, from Vice Minister Shah, especially on undersea warfare. And the question about the clarification on the territorial claims in the South China Sea of Taiwan. And of course, we can get into scenarios that maybe relate to Crimea, that is, scenarios about not annexation, I don't think, but certainly what we have just called tailored coercion in a new report that we've just published this last week. But Alan, let's go back to you to answer any of those questions you wish to touch on.
All right, I'll try to be quick. I'm not entirely sure, David, how you envisage evolution. I mean, my view of the TRA is it's been pretty constant. And, but that hasn't, as you say, prevented us from having a very robust relationship of various sorts. And I think that is the principle, I think, that we will continue to follow. But I think that the definition of specific activities under the TRA is something for, first of all, the U.S. government, since it's an American law, to be looking at, but to be also working out with Taiwan. What makes sense? But part of it has to do with, at the end of the day, if we do X, what's the impact on Taiwan's security? And I don't think it's necessarily a straight line. If you do such and such, which seems to bolster Taiwan's security, that at the end of the day it does. And that goes to Mr. Pulaski's question. I'm not a military expert, but I know a lot of people who would debate about some of the weapon systems that might be appropriate or not for Taiwan, and whether Taiwan's defense budget, and keep in mind we're dealing in a real world where defense budgets maybe starting at 3% is great, but it also politically may be a little bit difficult to think beyond that. You have to be pragmatic in that sense too. So I'm not going to try to answer or respond in terms of what specifically makes sense, but I don't think we're limited as long as we stay within the ground rules, the concepts of the TRA and the nature of the relationship between the United States and the people of Taiwan. On Crimea, I'm not one who tends to see lots of lessons coming out of Crimea for U.S. policy in East Asia. I think they're so dramatically different in terms of what our position is, what our interests are, how Russia has behaved versus anything else that might happen, that I would not try. I wouldn't try to draw that parallel.
Abe Denmark.
Sure. For the question on Taiwan's military capabilities and how to ensure its continued defense, I think, broadly speaking, we talked about the importance of coordination and cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan, of helping Taiwan develop or acquire the capabilities it needs to defend itself and to deter attack. I try not to talk too much publicly about ways that I think that Taiwan can do this, specifically as I believe the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. But overall, I think that's the general push of things. In terms of Crimea, it's a question that I hear a lot too, and I generally tend to have the same answer that Alan mentioned, in that I don't think that there's tremendous parallels between what's happening in Crimea and Ukraine and what's happening and what may happen in East Asia. As Patrick mentioned before the distinction that Victor Cha made between commitment and power. In both terms, the comparison between American commitment in Asia and American power in Asia is completely different than what we saw with Ukraine. And that from the conversations I've had with friends in East Asia, a lot of them have been talking about, one, the importance of an American commitment. They recognize that Russia is not invading countries that the United States has long-standing commitments and relationships with. They talk about their recognition that having economic dependence on one large nearby country is not a terribly favorable condition to be in, and so that's a lesson that they seem to be gaining. And third, that issues of territorial integrity and sovereignty are not guaranteed. That their power and military power, especially, is something that's important and needs to be considered. So those three things seem to me to be, if you can draw any parallels, that's where it seems to be. What's interesting to me, and this is opening up a whole other can, is that when I've talked with some friends from China about how they see the implications of what's happening in Crimea, I hear two completely incompatible interpretations. On one hand, there's a lot of concern about a foreign power intervening to defend the rights of ethnic minorities. For obvious reasons, China has its own minorities, some of whom are not necessarily all that happy with Beijing. And so some in China are very concerned about the precedent that this may set, about international intervention to nominally to protect minorities. On the other hand, I've seen some other scholars in China talking about how Russia has interest in defending ethnic Russians outside of its borders, which to me has potential parallels for China, which some scholars have said that China should think about the need for China to defend ethnic Chinese outside of its borders. So these are very different interpretations. I think China's having its own problems with interpreting the implications of Crimea for itself. But overall, I tend to agree with Alan that the direct parallels between the two are really not there.
I could just add my 2 cents worth on the Crimea question. 3 specific points. The broadest generalization is that a great power will protect its perceived core national interests, regardless of international opprobrium. So yes, that does apply to China in East Asia, push come to shove. But how the Chinese leadership on any given day defines the core interests, that's the tricky part. And why Russia decided on that day to define Crimea as definitely core interests, well, a lot of history there, but why on that day, in that way, push annexation? So the generalization only goes so far. Second point, though, is just as after the Syrian Red Line question, Americans get asked this question wherever they go around the world. And I think the question back for the United States is just how important a role we play and just the role that we are expected to play. And we even heard it from Vice Minister Shah. Where else is Taiwan going to turn? We hear these questions from South Koreans, from Japanese, from many in Southeast Asia. So remembering just how important a role the United States plays. But having said that, it's very difficult for the United States, like Goldilocks, to get the porridge just right. I heard from one Southeast Asian ambassador, a very learned man, about America needs to act like a bull in a china shop because we expect you to. Well, no, you don't. You want us to be strong, and you want us to be there and have your back, but you don't really want us to be upsetting the region with how strong we are. So getting it just right is a very difficult test for the United States leadership, and we never quite get it just right. But there's no substitute, finally, for constantly working at it. The engagement policy, building cooperation, but staying strong and making sure we preserve our comprehensive strength. And that's what you do on a daily basis, David, and we're grateful you do it along with many other officials. Let me turn to Joanna and then finally Vice Minister Shah for some closing remarks on this, is all we'll have time for.
Sure. I mean, I feel like I need to clarify about my statement about the rebalance. It pains me to disagree with Alan and Abe. But I think, there are two ways of looking at the rebalance in Taiwan, right? I mean, one, you could be very overt about it and say, we are going to incorporate Taiwan into the rebalance, and we're going to do A, B, C, and D. And there's another way is to kind of just do it quietly. But I think declarative policy is really important too, right? I mean, like if in a long line of, kind of a laundry list of what we're doing with all the different countries in Asia, Hagel and Carter have specific lines, and they're all bilateral relations with the United States, and then when it comes to Taiwan, its relationship with China, it does send a bad signal. I mean, I don't know if this is too bold, but just mention we'll continue to sell arms to Taiwan. I mean, that is totally within the One China policy, is within the TRA. I mean, it could be mentioned. But I think more quietly doing all the stuff that would enhance Taiwan security is important. And it would be helpful to use the rebalance as a mental construct, like a mental crutch, so to speak. Because I feel like right now, in terms of policy community, they think of Taiwan very narrowly in terms of cross-strait relations and how to defend Taiwan against China. And so it's just within that box. But it should be, but if you think of the rebalance is not about China, as Patrick mentioned. It's about the U.S. how to have a more comprehensive presence in the region, right? So that's why the U.S. is distributing troops from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. It's trying to figure out how to build resiliency, with its bases and overseas bases. I mean, it's about U.S. presence, and so thinking Taiwan in that broader sense hopefully will open up new avenues. Open up new avenues. And then regarding the Crimea, I think there are some parallels in terms of the Ukrainians are comfortable with having closer economic ties with an Eastern autocrat. I think in terms of what's happening in the Crimea, it's a fait accompli, right? So sometimes world leaders could have all the different discussions they want, but sometimes the facts on the ground could be physically enforced.
And Vice Minister Shah, you've been asked a point of international law, and of course you're quite an expert on international law, having studied this at length at New College at Oxford, among other places, but also the military modernization question in general. If you want to come back to that as kind of a final point in terms of what the U.S. should be doing to help work with Taiwan to keep a strong defense. You've had an enormously learned group of distinguished officers visiting with you during this week, and we've had in-depth discussions on this. But in brief, what is the bottom line for the U.S. in terms of supporting Taiwan's defense?
Let me first say that are there rooms for improvement or revolution in terms of the implementation of TRA? Absolutely. That is what happened during the past 35 years, from what it was until it is today. It's a quite impressive improvement. And I think TRA is a living piece of legislation that it has to adapt to the changing environment in the region, as well as in Taiwan. So I think, people always say we have to think out of the box, but I think if TRA is a box, this box is big enough for us to work inside this, according to the provisions of the TRA. Now, lesson learned from Crimea crisis, the Ukraine situation, certainly we learned a very important lesson that we have to modernize our military. Spending it, develop it ourselves, or working closely with the Americans. I think, in terms of military, we know China is rising. We know it's just impossible to compete with them on conventional terms. But when we talk about asymmetrical weapon systems to deter, I think it's of vital importance that we have we are, of course, quite sometimes good at developing ourselves, our own systems, but we need the support for sure from the United States. All these past few days we have discussions with some of your experts, and I think we have learned quite a few things, and we'd simply like to just sit down with the American side to discuss what is the most adequate assistance that is suitable for the Taiwan Strait. Now, as for the map showing all these dots in the South China Sea, I haven't seen the map. I'm sure various countries can show you various maps to prove that they have the historical claims of this country. I don't think it's helpful to drag Taiwan into this dispute at this moment. President Ma is a Harvard-educated international lawyer, and he always talk about international law. But again, when you talk about international law to defend one of your cause, you can cite different sources, different authorities to consolidate your position. But I think it's important for people to remember what we are proposing now is that the issue of sovereignty cannot be solved in near terms or even in mid-terms. So let's set that aside. Let's talk about a peaceful dialogue, restraint of action, acting in accordance with modern international law, and also a joint effort to explore the resources in the region. Otherwise, we just sit on the pot of gold there. But no country can benefit anything from that. Well, in conclusion, I simply want to say thank you very much for organizing this seminar. It's quite an honor for me, and I certainly hope my message to our American friends has been sent, that we appreciate very much the support. Without Taiwan Relations Act, I don't think Taiwan can survive for the past 35 years. Now, we not just survive, we survive well, and we sincerely, sending you our appreciation. We hope that in the next 50 years you will see Taiwan thriving and making not just a beneficiary of this Taiwan region, but also making contributions to the efforts of the United States in rebalancing, in setting up stability, security in the Southeast Asia or East Asia region. Thank you very much.
Vice Minister Shah, an excellent point on which to end. Before you thank the panel, including Vice Minister Shah, I just want to thank my colleagues at the Center for New American Security, especially Zachary Hosford, who's been at the center of organizing this entire involved event. Thank you, audience, everybody here, for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and listen to the Vice Minister and to listen to this very stimulating, insightful discussion on U.S.-Taiwan relations. Now, please thank the panel.